long as you're cool with doing it with a guy who's got a Band-Aid on his forehead, then I guess we're good to go.
3, 2, 1.
Hey, welcome back, everybody, for another episode of Work 20XX. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm really excited about this next guest. There really wasn't an opportunity to interview him before for all kinds of interesting reasons, but now we got a great opportunity. And welcoming in through the magic of the internet, all the way from San Francisco, is Brian Elliott. Brian, great to see you.
Great to see you, Jeff. Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely.
Glad that we finally made it work.
I know. It's always, I always tell people when they want to get in this business, the biggest challenge is scheduling challenges. So everything else is easy once you manage a schedule. But Brian, for those that don't know him, I'm not a big intro fan because you can check it all out on the internet, but he was the co-founder of Future Forum, which has a lot of great real data that we're going to get into. He also co-wrote How the Future Works. He was a former SVP at Slack and BCG and Google, so he's got some experience and he's got some data, so we're really excited to have him on. So, Brian, I'm just going to start with the big three that I get from people all the time on this topic. So let's just start with culture. How do people build culture, and what's the data say about culture for organizations that are not full-time on-site? Still, they're people. I just got a post the other day. Someone said, we have data that says, we got to be on site. That's the only way to get culture. That's not true at all, is it?
Not at all. Culture is all the behaviors that you exhibit no matter where you are. It's how you treat people. It's what you emphasize, what you reward, what you resource, and who and what gets new opportunities and gets promoted. Those are the signals you send people to tell them what kind of culture you really have. It's not the slogans on the wall and the meals and all the rest of that stuff. It's how you treat people. It's what you focus on. The data itself, at Future Forum, one of the things we dug into is what builds culture and connection, right? And there really is an element to this that is being together. One of the phrases that I've always used is, even if you're digital first, that doesn't mean never in person. It really is important that you get teams together for new team formation, as an example. And it's really important, even if you've got a team that's well formed, to get them together on a regular basis. We did this on a quarterly basis. We would spend 3 days together, and it would be largely about socialization and connection and relationship building. We would do volunteer activities together. We would make and eat meals together. Like, finding ways to get that sort of in-depth time is really important for building a deeper understanding of one another and real connection. But it's what you do on a day in, day out basis that matters too, right? So the data that we looked at shows that people who have flexibility in where and when they work are actually more connected to their teams than those that are 5 days a week in the office. And that may sound kind of weird when you just first think about it, but if you go a little bit deeper on it and you understand that, like, my giving you the freedom and flexibility to work from home when you want to do heads down work, or to even be more distributed but come together occasionally, is saying that I'm going to base my assessment of you on the outcomes you drive, not whether or not you show up. It says I trust you.
Right.
And nothing builds connection like trust in the first place. So there's a lot there to unpack and get into in terms of connection and culture also.
Yeah, we'll dive in. We'll just kind of skim over the top, and then we'll go deep dive. And the great line that Kate Lister uses all the time, is nine floors, 9 states, or 9 time zones. People have been distributed in work for a very long time. And, whether it's plane, trains, or automobile, or even a salesperson out, working his accounts and out in the field. This is not that new. It's interesting that it take on this strange characteristics, but this has been going on for a long time.
Absolutely. Jeff, I had 25 years of leading, teams and companies in the tech space. And I haven't had a team that's been co-located in the same city, let alone the same building, in over 20 years. So it's not like the pandemic was the only change that was happening. Teams are already distributed. We just got more distributed. We need to learn how to manage and lead distributed teams.
So let's talk about the big P that everyone likes to throw out, which is productivity. And I had a conversation with someone the other day talking about knowledge workers, and they're trying not even to use the productivity word anymore because it's hard to measure more even effectiveness against objectives. And I think that, to me, that's the heart of it. And I think it's the heart of the pushback, is a lot of middle managers that weren't trained to manage this way don't necessarily have the objectives as clearly defined so that they're measuring against objectives versus presenteeism, which is a word, unfortunately, we've all had to learn.
Yep. Yeah. And like, outcomes driven management is a skill, and it takes time, it takes investment. It also takes an organization that's willing to say, what are our objectives? what are our key results and how are we going to measure them, and to do that on a regular, ongoing basis. And, Google got famous for OKRs, objectives and key results. Salesforce has the V2 MOM. Having a method like that matters a lot, but you also have to show people how to do it in order to make it work. And I think one of the things that happened is, the pandemic just kind of shined a light on mediocre management practices, right? They always existed in the past. It just became a lot more evident that if your only method of managing your team was monitoring whether or not their butts were in their seats, you didn't really know whether they were working then or not either. So that's why this whole productivity thing makes me slightly crazy. It is really hard to measure in knowledge work, if not impossible. And why weren't we asking the same question when people were in offices? Because we didn't have a heck of a lot of evidence quite often that was an effective way of measuring it either.
Yeah, Martin Mikos' great line, because when he was at MySQL many years ago, he went into all remote situations, even though they all lived pretty close to one another, because they just like working that way. And his great line is, "It's so easy to fake it at the office. You go in, you look busy, you make sure you kiss the boss's butt a little bit, and bring him a fresh coffee, and you're golden." And he says, the only thing you have to show when you're remote or not in the office is your output. And so it's you get the benefits on both sides, but it's a great line. So then the Absolutely. Third one is innovation, and this is a big one that is more important today than ever before, right? The world is moving quickly. Time in the Fortune 500 is as short as it's ever been. So if you're not innovating, you're falling behind. And there's a secret that some people don't know that is enabled by this style of work that actually drives innovation, and that's psychological safety. And most people just don't put those two things together. What's the data say?
Yeah. So, what I hear all the time on that front is we need to get back into whiteboards and water coolers because that's what drives innovation. It doesn't. There's plenty of academic evidence around that. And whiteboarding exercises are largely groupthink. We did this study back in 2021 on this and dug into it. If you took teams that were co-located, if they were hybrid mixed mode, if they were fully remote, and compared them on the basis of their team's ability to generate new ideas, new products, new services, change processes, no difference whatsoever, like zero statistical correlation or causality between where they were located. There were two other factors that did. There were two questions we asked folks that were really clear indicators. One was, is my team willing to take risks? And the other was, is it okay for me? Do I feel safe asking questions? And those two things are psychological safety, right? It's do the people who are the introverts have the space to actually formulate their ideas and bring them forward? Do the people who don't look like the majority or who aren't the loudmouths have the time and space to actually, put forward new ideas that might be heretical or might be different? That's where innovation comes from. It comes from blending people from different disciplines, different backgrounds with different ideas, but it's really about how are you creating the conditions under which they can contribute that actually drives innovation. We had this practice that we used that I heard about first from Adam Grant called brainwriting, which is we would get a research body of work that would come out once a quarter or so. It would be a 120 some odd page long piece of work. And what we would ask everybody on the team to do is sit with it, spend a couple of hours, heads down, notifications off, spending time going through it and pull out what you think are the most 3 to 5 important findings from it. Write those down. Doesn't have to be like a long write-up, just jot down what they are. Now, we're going to have a meeting. Everybody at the beginning of the meeting, throw all of your ideas into the pot at once. Now we can do the sortation exercise. We can see what stands out, what's common, what's different. And you're not doing that pre-filtering that happens otherwise. You can also therefore put these processes in place that will give you a much better odds of those innovative ideas coming forward than if you simply say, hey, let's just throw people back together and rely on random chance as our mechanism for driving innovation at work.
Yeah. I'm just curious of those things. So how many people were in the room times 3? How much overlap was there generally where people were picking the same item?
It was usually there would be one or two that really stood out to everybody. I mean, a lot of our work, the stuff that especially early on, if you look back at some of our research, the stuff that really stood out were two things. One was time matters more than place, giving people schedule flexibility, giving people heads down time when they're good for doing work to get work done. benefits, productivity benefits, well-being benefits, all kinds of things personally and organizationally. And the other was the disproportionate benefits that flexibility brings to especially women with children, because mom more often than dad is the primary caregiver, and the benefits that it brings to people across race and ethnicity. Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Asian American office workers are more likely to benefit from flexibility than their white colleagues because it gives them a break from code switching and microaggressions. And that data showed up early on. Everybody's like, those two things are really important because it's not what people would have expected. Let's make sure we get into that. But then what would happen is we'd find these other little nuggets that would sit in other places that got at things like how, it was surprising to me as somebody who spent a couple of decades getting people into offices to build culture, that people who got flexibility actually rated culture much higher than those that had, less flexibility in where they worked. And so those types of things would pop out from time to time, and somebody would go, that's important. We should actually focus on that.
Right. Scott Cook from Intuit, who, has built an amazing company basically from a checkbook register. I got the opportunity to interview him, and his thing is build your company based on low-cost experiments. And the only way to do that and to have more people experimenting with more data and trials is what happens when it goes wrong, right? Because by rule, a certain percentage of those are going to go wrong. So if you just jump down their throat and, tear their head off, your experimentation is going to go down, and that directly ties to psychological safety and innovation. It's not that complicated.
Absolutely. And we don't live in a world in which going backwards is likely to be the right solution, right? It's not like the world's going to stop changing. Like we're going to go back to the way things worked in 2015, 2018, to me is, do you think that everything else is going to go backwards? Because we're now living in this world in which all of a sudden, the daily news about generative AI, the kind of global nature of competition these days, and ongoing demographic shifts, it's not going to get easier to find talented people. It's not going to the world of work is not going to get simpler. It's going to get more complex, more complicated.
Right.
And so what you're really need to do is enlist people in that set of processes. And you're going to have to get there through experimentation, through iteration, through, unfortunately, ongoing work. I've talked to a number of executives who said, I think part of the challenge is, for about 2 years now, we've all expected that in the next 90 days, we're going to have the answer. We're not going to have the answer. I have some hard news for you. We're in a world of continuous change and evolution. So therefore, allowing your team the space to try new things, to innovate, and finding those pockets of innovation internally and making them into heroes is really one of the best paths forward that I've seen.
Yeah, the VUCA, as they say. So we're in summertime. You got beautiful sunlight behind you, and you've mentioned in other things that we're heading into, one of your favorite seasons, which is the Labor Day call back to office. As you think about that, and then ironically, Sundar, who makes great tools in Google Workplace, just had his pronouncement, please let's everybody come back to the office. We're going to rate you on attendance. So it's not a good thing. And there's been this pull and tug. I think it was Apple was the signature one a couple of years ago. As you talk to people on this kind of tug and pull, on this proclamation of back to the office from on high, ironically, I have this new report from Phil McKinsey, who says everyone is high on the declaring what they want to do, but low all the way to the right is on training and training middle managers to actually execute well. And it seems like this complete mismatch of prioritization.
Honestly, if we put the amount of time and energy we're putting into how many days a week somebody should be in the office is a little ridiculous, because what it's doing is it's breeding resentment among employees, not really solving root problems, right? Those companies that you announced and many others have made these announcements. They've made these announcements continually for a couple of years. And if you look at the stats, if you look at things like even Castle Systems data, which is, published broadly, it ain't moving. I can name a number of companies that have said 3 days a week, and they've even said, here's the specific 3 days a week we expect you to be in for 2 years now. And the number that they're getting is 1.5. And when they did a round of layoffs, 1.5 became 1.7. Then about 2 weeks later, it went back to 1.5. And the reason is, when you're saying those things, you're giving a one size fits all answer, right? And one size does not fit all. Teams have actually become, this is back to Kate Lister and talking about distributed teams. We were distributed before, we're more distributed now. Almost every large scale company went from being something like 50 to 70% of their teams being geographically co-located to less than 50% of their teams being geographically co-located. So Jeff, if you're telling me I need to be in 3 days a week for, teamwork and team aspects, and my team isn't even in the same city, it rings false. And I'm like, why are we spending time arguing about this one? Better approaches have been, how do you take a team level agreement approach? We talk about this in How the Future Works, the book, a lot. It's on the Future Forum website and everything else. But the needs of an engineering team and a sales team, the needs of the people who work in R&D labs in a biotech company are all very different. How do you help those senior leaders figure out what the rules of the road are for their organization and put that locus where it should be? And that's the meeting point, because to be honest, the mandates don't work, but neither does individual choice. A complete free-for-all is also not going to work for us. We need to figure out, like at a team level, what's the right balancing point. Doing that takes work. You have to train people to do it. You have to pilot it. You have to do it. And you know what? When you do it with, call it 200 senior leaders, it ain't going to go perfectly. You're going to have people that spend real time with their teams on it and go in depth and do good work on it. And you're going to have people that check the box and file the paperwork. The trick is, what do you do next? One of the companies that I've been talking with is actually doing this. They're going back and they're taking those 200 plus team level agreements and they're looking at the various aspects of how those teams are performing. What's their employee engagement look like? How are they performing against their plans? And they're going to map those out in terms of quality of the planning that they did, the work that they put into it, and the engagement their employees have and how their outcomes are working out. I guarantee you there will be a relationship, because just the act of engaging your employees in the conversation drives employee engagement. We all know, and there's plenty of evidence that also drives better outcomes.
Right.
So, man, let's get off the top level mandates and let's figure out, like, hey, here's what we want everyone to do. And we want you to spend time doing this because it's important.
Right. Let's dive into the details a little bit about communication. Our friend Darren Murph, when I first interviewed him early 2020, was, just banging the drum on async communication. It was really kind of a light bulb moment for me in the effectiveness of that, and, moving more work to async so that you get more quality time when you are either working or spending time, with the team members. You have kind of a unique view from inside of Slack, and, obviously don't say any secrets, but I'm curious in terms of, kind of older people that look like you and I and their adoption of digital tools, but also, without, as you said, without rules, is it just become another random Wild West thing that I have to manage on top of my emails, on top of my texts, on top of everything else. So, what did you see in terms of what really worked, what didn't work, kind of where does stuff go on the rails, and maybe just what are some best practices in helping people be more effective in an async digital tools world?
Yeah, the big thing here is just to even focus on what's the benefit and value to the organization. So here's one of the things that we've been wrestling with for a while, which is, I sort of said this earlier, time matters more than place, but it really is true. When you look at the ability to give people solid blocks, 2 to 3 hour chunks of time when they can be heads down, notifications off, whenever it's good for them, whether that's, before 9 o'clock in the morning or 1 till 3 in the afternoon, if you can find ways to do that, you get a lot more productivity out of those people and a lot more engagement. We spend all this time on days a week in the office. We spend so little time on something that executives and employees agree on, which is we have too many meetings.
Right.
And the pandemic made this worse. Unfortunately, we adopted video as the solution for a lot of problems, and synchronous video meetings. The 30-minute Zoom call became the solution for way too many problems, and it made our days into Swiss cheese, right? That even became worse. So in order to fix this set of problems, first issue is recognize you have a problem. And a lot of companies will say, yeah, we do. We have a problem with too many meetings, but what do we do about it? Next step is, how do you start piloting out some new programs and put some constraints in place? So my team did core collaboration hours. 9 a.m. until 1 o'clock on the West Coast was our time, not only for meetings and one-on-ones, but you had to be available then for in-sync conversations. A quick phone call works just as well. And by the way, a 5-minute phone call may save you a 30-minute video screen. But finding practices like that put constraints, but you also have to help people convert what would have been a meeting into an asynchronous set of behaviors. So my favorite on that one is the status meeting. We've all been in these status meetings that are the classic, like Monday morning operations meeting. It's got 75 people in it. 75 people, of whom probably at any point in time, 70 of them are sitting there basically doing something else or trying to get something else done. because that hour and a half Monday meeting is really not the most productive use of their time.
Right.
All they need to do is report status on a project. Please change that. Think about ways in which you sit there and do what we did at Slack, which is we had to do this ourselves. By Friday at noon, status is due on the system of record. It's Jira. You have to update statuses. Managers of teams are responsible for identifying which projects are on track or off track and submitting those. The Monday meeting then goes from being a 75-person, hour and a half long conversation to being a 30-minute, 15-person conversation where the same 10 or so executives always have to be there to resolve problems, to deal with conflicts, to figure out resource issues. But who has to show up changes based on where are those bottlenecks, where are those pinch points. So it's that combination of both. Like, please, we don't need to do the weekly pipeline review live and in person on a sales team every week, do we? We can do that every other week, asynchronously. And that helps develop some patterns and some rhythms. So it really is partly about the tools, but it's really about the managerial processes and showing people, giving them concrete examples. So the best in the world at this are people who have taken those practices internally, found the team that's already doing some of it, training them, getting them to be better at it, and getting them to share the story of how they did it with another part of the organization, and then growing it from there. Yeah. That's how you get better adoption.
It's funny. I had Shani Harmon on. She runs a company called Stop Meeting Like This. And her two number one things, immediately stop them now are the inform. Like, I could have just read it. Don't make me sit for an hour. And the weekly, just to your point, her line is, it basically turns into a series of one-on-ones with a very large audience. And, again, and then to your point, you squeeze your working time in, like after the kids go to bed or super early in the morning before the work time starts. And you never are working during your best work time for you, the individual, as opposed to this company. But double click on the kind of mutually agreed to collaboration window, because I think that's an interesting concept that I don't hear get enough pub, that I think is really important. So you do have that block that you can comfortably schedule the meeting when you do have to have it, or the phone call or the quick chat.
Exactly. And it takes some discipline to build that, because everyone's got this issue of cross-team collaboration also, right? Well, if I do that for my team, how do I get everybody else to respect those boundaries? And the answer is you have to work with your peers to actually make it work, right? Like, we did this with the Future Forum team, but we worked every week, almost every day sometimes, with the research organization, with the comms team, with marketing people, with sales people. And you would sit there and remind them continuously, hey, can we put the standing meetings into these windows, please? Which we did, and found a way to corral those inside. And the other thing is to realize there's going to be exceptions, just like there are today, right? But the fact that it has to be an exception triggers a different process. If it's not unusual for me to get a call from a salesperson that says, hey, you know what? Nike, which is a big Slack customer, wants to have a call with you, Brian, and it's got to be 6:00 at night on a Tuesday. I'm like, big important client, I'm going to take the call. Do the same thing as a team. Hey, look, folks, there's something that's come up. We really need to hop onto a call. This person's only available at 3:00. Can you make it? The benefit of doing it that way is it protects that time more often for people to get their core work done. And it also respects the boundaries of teams that are more geographically distributed. I had people on the East Coast. I'm on the West Coast. Me scheduling a meeting regularly at 4:00 in the afternoon here may be fine for me, but it's 7:00 there, which means I'm interrupting somebody's dinner with their kids. Not cool.
Right.
So it's just practice and discipline to make that work.
The other piece of it that I think people are tying together is kind of the servant leadership or service leadership, depending which word you like better, and using those times not to micromanage the deliverables or the time schedule, but to actually engage specifically with the person and help them remove roadblocks, and use your power as a boss, whether that's resources, time, money, whatever you have, to actually help move the ball forward for all the members of the team versus micromanaging all their individual tasks. It's a completely different way of kind of organizing your thoughts, organizing your time, and really what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an element to this, which I learned at Google. The phrase was essentially, escalations are okay. We treat escalations as a bad word. Escalations are good. An escalation is, this team and this team cannot resolve this conflict. There are times when that is going to be natural because they both need access to a key resource, or that their missions are somewhat in conflict with one another. That's why bosses exist. That's kind of our job. Our job should be to resolve those kind of conflicts and to do the sort of resource mediation that has to happen for teams in order to make them operate more smoothly. There's also a level down from that. One of the things that I've talked with a lot of leaders about is how do we help new managers in particular not just learn the task of management, but get really tactical with them. Like, what's a good one-on-one look like? You should have a one-on-one with members of your team every week. You should do the same thing every week. It should feel to you a little rote, but what did you work on last week and how did it go? What are your priorities for this week to make sure that we're aligned? And what's blocking you? What's in your way that I can help you unblock? And if you teach people to do that same thing week in and week out, that's where this whole thing of like, but if we give people trust, won't they go off the rails? Not if you're actually having the conversation on a regular basis. Trust doesn't mean I let you go off for 3 months into the wilderness. It means I'm working with you to make sure that we're on track, and then I'm giving you the tools, resources you need in order to be effective in the job.
Yeah. The other one Adrian Rowe likes to use is agency, even as a substitute for flexibility, because flexibility is kind of an outcome of agency, but it's like treat people like adults. If you can't trust them to treat them like adults to do what they're supposed to do, then you got different problems, which also goes back to, I think I read one of the questions in one of your write-ups on, I need help, which kind of, circles back to psychological safety. If they're not willing to ask you for help, then bad news doesn't go up to the boss. Bad things happen if it takes a long time and they never see what's really going on. So that's another, super important component of this piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Katarina Berg at Spotify, she's their chief human resource officer, had this phrase that I love too on that same topic, which is, we hire adults. Why do we treat them as children? If your hiring process isn't hiring adults for you, maybe you have something else that you ought to be reviewing as you're going through this. But look, man, the world's changing way too fast on us for us to assume that command and control is the right answer for all of these things. We've got to find a way to invest instead in the systems that allow people to do what they want to do, which is deliver outcomes and be rewarded for those outcomes. But to do that, we need to figure out what are our objectives? What are the key things that we're after? What's our purpose? And how are we going to train people to sort of make sure that they're managing that and enabling that to happen, as opposed to being hall monitors.
Right. Darren's got a great quote too. If you allow people to do the things that are important to them outside of work too, the reward that you give as an employer in terms of productivity and enthusiasm, are off the hook because they're living a better life. And Toby Redshaw, who was at FedEx for a long time, he had a great line in terms of discretionary effort. And his quote was, if you're in a boat and everybody's rowing, the difference of somebody who's actually cares and rowing hard versus someone who's just sitting in the boat could be 30%, 50%, 2x, 3x. And so, how do you get that discretionary effort and that alignment around the missions? And it goes back to communication, not micromanaging.
But there's also a mindset shift, Jeff, that I've had to make here myself, which is a lot of us got trained as leaders that we need to have all the answers. I had this phrase that got taught to me very early on in my career as a consultant, that I should be seldom wrong and never in doubt. I needed to be pretty confident in knowing the answers to all these questions. And you're often rewarded as an executive, especially as a white guy as an executive, for doing that, because that pressure is there, and so you respond to it. The world is way too complex for that to be the right answer for most people, but it's really hard for executives to let go of that. Well, then what do I do? Because I'm supposed to be setting vision. The answer is, yeah, you got it. Your job is to set vision and set aspiration, which is, here's the mountaintop that we're going to get to. Here is the thing that we are going to accomplish as a team. I believe in all of us and our ability to get there. I don't fully know the path. So I need all of you to work with me so that we can get there together. And that's both like painting the vision, the aspiration, being super motivational, holding people accountable to outcomes, but also saying, I trust you to figure out how you're going to get that work done. I don't care when you do it. I don't care where you do it, but we're going to get it done. And that is where you get engagement. That's where you get people to be aspirational along with you, which is at the end of the day what we all want.
Right. I just was watching an old, it's a great video. It's Pierre Nantam. He's the former CEO of Accenture. Unfortunately, he passed away, but it's from 2012, and he's speaking at his old business school where he went to school. So he's feeling good, and it's a small class. And he just said you cannot manage and lead at the same time. You just can't. He's like, if I'm leading a global organization, this is 2012, I can't be managing what's happening in China because then I'm not in Brazil. And then if I'm managing what's happening in Brazil, I can't manage what's happening in China. And he just talked about the difference. And even as, he's like, for 26 years, I was a manager. For the last 3, I've been a leader, and it's a very different job. And I have to trust my managers to do the job. And then if they've got issues, then I need, can I help them resolve it? This is 2012. Come on.
There's a back and forth there. There's an analogy there that I love that I learned, a while ago, which is dance floor and balcony. When you're a frontline manager, you're down on the dance floor. You're in the mix of it. You're in the thick of it, and you're hearing the music, and you're in with your team, and you're going at it. As a more senior leader, you've got to get up on the balcony where you can see the patterns and the rhythms and understand if the music and the lights, are on and all the rest of that, and you're directing more of it. The challenge is you got to be able to go back down onto the dance floor also, right? You can't just stay up on the balcony. You got to go down every once in a while to realize how badly people are stepping on one another's toes. You got to get down there to hear that the music and the lights aren't really in sync with one another in the way that you expected them to be. It's not that you necessarily have to do that yourself, but you've got to listen to your employees who will tell you that that's what's going on. I think that's part of what's happening, by the way, in our world today, which is a lot of senior executives are coming back into offices that are very empty, and they're not hearing the music. They're not hearing the noise. They're not hearing the chatter. Look, I was CEO of a small company in 2008, 2009, the last time we went through a recession. And, being there and really helping people come together and listening to what was going on was really important because it was challenging times. I think execs now are going, I'm not hearing that and I'm not seeing it. And therefore I'm worried. I'm worried either are people really, actually working at home, but I'm also worried that maybe they don't get it. The challenge is a lot of those execs also aren't in the digital tools their teams are using, right? I've heard this so many times. My team is in Slack or it's in Teams, but my leadership team is in email and text messages and in the office. And if we want to converse with them, we literally have to do this translator layer where we take, content out of one tool and put it into another. That's painful for your team because they're bringing that data to you, number one. But number two, you're just missing it.
Right.
You're missing out on the fact that if you think you're worried about your business and its performance, your employees are even more worried about your business and its performance. They're just having the conversation in a different place than where you are. So you've got to find a way as an executive, get off that balcony and down onto the dance floor and get into it.
What's interesting is in the physical world, there's so many inhibitors to actually that communication, right? There's all kinds of gatekeepers. And if you sound like you had a relatively small company. If you have any size of the company, to try to get any kind of message to anyone with authority, there's so many blockers, whether it's admins or TAs or whatever. And the tools are not easy. Where in a digital space, maybe I've put up a quick instant message. By the very nature of the tools, it's short and kind of to the point. And, Adrian Rowe had an interesting question. We should spend less time worrying about getting the kids to the office and a lot more time training the older white guys like you and I to use today's digital tools because that's the way the world works today. And, kind of forget going back to the 50s. This is what you need to do, to your point, to get your fingers on the pulse of what's going on.
Well, and every executive knows this. About the time that every executive that I know has heard this a dozen and more times. About the time that you are completely bored with your message, that you're sick of saying it, of delivering it, of getting in front of people and saying it, about half your audience has finally heard it for the first time. Okay. So the larger your organization, by the way, the worse that problem is, whether, it was me with 350 people or Google with 3,000. This problem compounds a little bit, but it's still the same issue, which is people absorb information in different ways. Some people need it in writing. Some people need the visual. Some people need the video or the live, verbal conversation about it. Some people take more time to do it. Digital gives you some great mechanisms for doing that. Shared video is your friend, right? A public channel internally that allows people to ask questions, that has rules of the road around what questions you're going to answer and when you're going to answer them and what standards of behavior are like, are great ways to get people invested in that message as well. That's a big part of it. Is we are now, as executives, a big part of our job, if not almost all of our job, is communication and enlistment of our people in things. That does involve the events and the all hands and all the rest of it. But those things, for every team that's distributed, think about the difference between, the headquarters staff and the message they're getting versus everybody else, that maybe 80% of your employee population.
Yeah, it's funny, Pierre. The same thing. He was a French CEO running an Irish company with most of their employees in Brazil and India at the time of the recording, and he actually said having a headquarters is bad because it aggregates this certain amount of gravitas around that place. He's like, I don't want a headquarters. I don't want this central place because that's not the way the world works. It's not Jack Welch's GE anymore. Things are moving way, 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 way too fast. And, just another concept to get your thoughts on is kind of hyper-personalization versus average. And I think that's a big part of the return to office conversation. I think Ryan Anderson had a post this morning. And, unfortunately, for cost reasons, offices got to be average versus hyper-personalization around activities. The whole rest of our life is hyper-personalized. Our media is hyper-personalized. Everything's hyper-personalized. To think that average is going to work, then go back to average just makes no sense to me.
No, not at all. And Ryan's got way more insight into workplace design than I do by far. But, we spent a couple of decades shrinking average square foot per human, putting more people into open office floor plans, which demonstrably makes their desire to integrate with each other, to converse with each other, go down because it's too loud. So people put their headphones on and they hunker in, right? It doesn't help. Now people are coming back in, and what was done for the last 20 years is even worse, right? Because what they need is the flexibility to say, hey, look, my team's coming together for 3 days. I need a space for my team to work together for that period of time. But all the meeting rooms are booked up like crazy. And then also, by the way, during that, 10 of us need on occasion to go off and do individual calls or to have some quiet heads down space. The demands for that sort of flexible modular space are huge, and we have not equipped ourselves to do it, let alone the small problem called Wi-Fi and how many meetings people are attempting to take inside of office buildings that weren't wired for this in the first place. So if I'm being told to come back and I'm coming back and the setup is worse than home, and the commute makes me less productive than I was, and I can't even find my team to be together and sit together, and we can't get a meeting room, tell me again why you're making me do this.
Yeah, and the fact that I'm carrying the entire world's information, including all the office information, in my phone now. I don't have the kids' pictures on my cube anymore. They're on the phone. The file cabinet's on the phone. I don't even have a phone number anymore. That's on the phone. It's interesting how all these things have merged, and then there's this, I think, one of your great lines, right? Executive nostalgia of a past that didn't exist. So it's kind of interesting.
Credit where credit's due. Taryn Brim on my team came up with that one first, but a lot of leaders are expressing nostalgia for the way things worked back then, right? And they're basing a lot of these decisions, unfortunately, in our research, 65% of execs tell us that those future work plans are being made with little to no direct input from employees, which is a shame because as an executive, I grew up in a very different era than most of my team did, right? Not only from a technology perspective, but also from a demographic perspective, social perspective, or whatever else. What made me successful, especially as a white male, non-primary caregiver, is going to be very different from what it takes for my team more broadly to be successful in doing it. That executive nostalgia is a set of blinders that is going to be problematic for a number of organizations as the world continues to unfold in terms of the need for broad-based, diverse talent.
Yeah. So we're getting towards the end of our time, and actually I went to that Pierre question because ultimately at the end of the day, he's got this great line that demographic trends trump everything. And we know that, birth rates are going down in a lot of developed countries. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the talent shortage, despite the current kind of hiccups in terms of layoffs and stuff, is not going to get easier. It's going to get harder. So to be able to attract, engage, and retain people is only going to get harder. So when you think of what you're talking to people, what you're seeing on the street, because that demographic wave doesn't matter what you do. That's a big one that moves slowly. What are you seeing? What are you telling people? How are you telling them they need to kind of deal with the world in which we live in today? And Lord only knows what it's going to be tomorrow.
Part of it is helping executives themselves are challenged too, right? You never want to, it's like pull out the world's tiniest violin. I recognize that. But change is hard for anybody. And so helping people understand that these trends are not in the favor of things going back to the way they used to, right? Technology change is only advancing, not retracting. Demographic shifts are going to continue to happen. And by the way, if you think you have a talent shortage now, just wait. It's only going to get worse because Western economy demographics are declining populations. What happens then? Pretty scary stuff. But what that means is that as executives, we've got to sit there and go, I'm going to have to see through someone else's eyes. I'm going to have to take the time to recognize that a lot of the preconceived notions that I've got about what worked for me may not be right for sizable parts of my population. And that's frustrating. That's hard and that's challenging. But it's helping people understand that that is where the world is headed and helping them sort of step back, listen to their own employees, and figure out what's going on there. Deloitte just shared their story recently of doing this with their own organization. They opened up their own return to office planning process to 90,000 employees, right? And found a way to instrument it. And one of the findings they had in doing that was a lot of the notions they had about, for example, younger workers were false, right? That they made the assumption based on like, well, I've talked to my kids and they want to be back in the office more often. So therefore, this must be how that younger generation is thinking. They then looked at the results and saw that people in their first 3 years of being with the organization had just as much diversity of opinion about what they needed as those in their third decade. So that was a surprise to them. Unless you're actually engaging your employees directly in this, it's not going to work. And that's not just about things like return to office. That's how are we going to leverage and utilize things like generative AI, right? It's the same set of challenges, which is the way that you do that is you figure out how do you enlist people in that process so that they're not scared. Many of them, by the way, are already doing it. How do you help them figure out what problems they need to have solved that this can help solve? How do you support them with training? And here's the crazy part. If you thought mediocre managers were a problem during remote, wait until you see what mediocrity of management does as generative AI starts showing up. Because all of the problems that you've got today with new technology and what it can do within organizations is going to be compounded dramatically. You've got to expend the time in training people to be outcomes driven, hypothesis led. This world is going to continue to evolve really fast on us.
Yeah. Well, Brian, it's so great to catch up on you, and also and thank you for all the work that you're doing, and a lot of people are doing, which is I think also helpful, just to provide the data, right? So like get off your assumptions and actually look at some data, and the work you've done at Future Forum to go survey the 10,000 people is super helpful. So really great to finally catch up, and it's been a real treat.
Thanks, Jeff. Great being here with you. I appreciate you bringing me on.
Oh, my pleasure. All right. He's Brian. I'm Jeff. You're watching Work 20XX. Thanks for watching. Listen on the podcast, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
And no blood came out of my forehead.
No
so that's
blood.
Good.
It would have been dramatic, though.
Before we started, it was not a slow drip. It was coming steadily down my forehead. So luckily that it held.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, thank you.